Before getting too negative here, it should be emphasized that directors continuing to work into their twilight years isn't inherently a bad thing. Akira Kurosawa directed Ran when he was in his 70s, after all, and Martin Scorsese was similarly in his 70s for most of the 2010s, and made some of his most compelling and interesting films during that decade. Scorsese hasn't stopped there, either, with Killers of the Flower Moon coming out in 2023, in which this year Martin Scorsese is 82 years old. Filmmakers who feel comfortable directing past the age when people in most other professions would have retired should be encouraged to do so. Indeed, older filmmakers sometimes seem willing to take risks they might have been too worried about taking before, or outright told they couldn't do so. But sometimes those risks don't pay off, as the following movies show, starting with some noble and mild misfires, and ending with some genuinely baffling titles. These films were all made by directors at least several decades into their filmmaking careers, but ultimately disappointed compared to much of what they'd made when they were younger. Number 10, Ferrari. Within the pantheon of Michael Mann movies, Ferrari is probably more disappointing than outright bad, and it does admittedly have its fans. It chronicles a particularly dramatic time in the life of Enzo Ferrari, exploring his martial issues and some setbacks related to his career, with the film slowly building to the harrowing events of the infamous 1957 Mille Miglia. Ferrari is kind of odd, with an unusual pace throughout and a somewhat awkward blend of melodrama and what seems to be a focus on realism. Certain points of the racing sequences look convincing, while other parts look weird, especially what's supposed to be the most shocking part of the film. It doesn't feel like a movie that was made by a director in control of things. Different cast members feel like they're in different films, and it's surprisingly sleep-inducing, considering the subject matter. Ferrari isn't without things to appreciate, but it can feel pretty loose and disconnected. Number 9, The BFG. Steven Spielberg has made all sorts of movies throughout his decade-spanning career, and has mastered more tonally than many might give him credit for. And some of his late-era movies have been of a very high quality, with both West Side Story and The Fabelmans being released when Spielberg was well into his 70s, and largely satisfying as a musical and a personal/semi-autobiographical family drama respectively. The BFG, on the other hand, is not very good at all, and feels awkward alongside the better family-friendly films Spielberg has directed, like E.T. the Extraterrestrial Land, yes, even Hook. Some of this impresses technically, but it doesn't capture any of the charm that can be found in the original Roald Dahl story, owing to the humor feeling fairly awkward and the uncanny valley being somewhere the movie lurches dangerously close to, thanks to its animation. Number 8, The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. The Man Who Killed Don Quixote was one of those passion projects that seemed as though it would never see the light of day, until eventually, and miraculously, it did. Terry Gilliam's ambition can't be faulted, but the final product was disappointing, with The Man Who Killed Don Quixote not exactly working as a comedy and only sometimes functioning as a meta-adventure movie about filmmaking. Terry Gilliam can and has done a great deal better, as when he's at his best, he tends to specialize in blending dark/surreal comedy with imaginative fantasy/sci-fi. Whether The Man Who Killed Don Quixote was an attempt to do something a little different or recapture the charms of his older films isn't entirely clear. In all honesty, it's not really a movie that works on either one of those fronts. Number 7, Nouvelle Vague. For fans of French cinema, particularly those films released closer to the middle of the 20th century, Nouvelle Vague is likely to sound enticing, given it's a collaboration between Jean-Luc Godard as director and Alain Delon as lead actor. Similarly intriguing is the fact that the title translates to New Wave, with most of Godard's best-known movies being those associated with the French New Wave. So, is Nouvelle Vague a throwback to famed art house titles like Breathless or Pierre Olafou? Not at all, and it's not really radical in new or exciting ways, either, like those films would have felt back in the 1960s. Nouvelle Vague is Godard at his most pretentious, floundering around with quoting various pieces of literature in an attempt to sound smart, all the while the film tells no story and provokes/frustrates seemingly for the sheer hell of it. It's grating and tedious, running for 89 minutes but making that runtime feel like 8.9 hours. Please note that Nouvelle Vague isn't available on streaming services in the US. Number 6, Dying of the Light. Sure, Nicolas Cage has starred in worse movies than Dying of the Light, but he's also been in a good number that are much, much better. It's one of the weakest films directed by Paul Schrader, though, who thankfully bounced back to some extent in the years following the release of Dying of the Light, most notably with First Reformed and The Card Counter. But to focus on this 2014 film, it's a messy thriller about a CIA agent locked in a psychological and eventually physical battle with a terrorist he's clashed with in the past. There's talent involved both behind and in front of the camera when it comes to Dying of the Light, but the whole movie is also weirdly boring in execution, and just generally doesn't work as well as it probably should. Number 5, The 1517 to Paris. There's an interesting premise, though some might call it a gimmick, to The 1517 to Paris, given it tells a true story and involves some of the people involved in those real-life events playing themselves. And these people were never actors in the first place, instead being 3 people who thwarted an attempted terrorist attack on a train in 2015, then reenacted those events for the film. It's a noble and bold way to push the whole docudrama genre, or subgenre, to new levels, or closer to documentary than ever before, but the acting does end up leaving something to be desired. Clint Eastwood's body of work has always had its highs and lows, but of the films he's made in the past decade or so, The 1517 to Paris is probably the sloppiest. Number 4, Domino. Not to be mixed up with the 2005 Tony Scott film of the same name, 2019's Domino is instead directed by Brian De Palma. Though both can fairly be called crime thrillers. Domino, 2019, is about a police officer and CIA agent getting tangled up in conflicts against ISIS for their own reasons, in turn getting in the way of the other's plan. It is, to date, Brian De Palma's most recent film, and it also has a shot at being considered his weakest, sadly enough. It would be a shame if things concluded here, but at the same time, Domino has already been mostly forgotten, even though it only came out in the late 2010s. Meanwhile, De Palma's classics, like Scarface, Blowout, Carrie, and The Untouchables are likely to endure for decades to come, if not even longer. Number 3, Megalopolis. Even though the execution of the marketing was off, perhaps the sentiment of the infamous Megalopolis trailer will age well one day, at a point somewhere in the future. Maybe the world isn't ready for something so bizarre and uncompromising. Sure, the film does have some fans already, but even a lot of the positive buzz around Megalopolis expresses some confusion about it, with a common sentiment being "I'm just glad it exists," words of that sort. It's at least an interesting watch, even if it's more than a bit of a mess, and fluctuates between goofy, tedious, and overly sentimental at the drop of a hat. You should pick up that hat. Francis Ford Coppola, as usual, had a vision he was able to realize. Probably. It's hard to tell for sure, but that's also one of the things that makes Megalopolis fascinating. It's not always fun to watch, but there are moments that, for better or worse, may stick with you. Number 2, Exodus, Gods and Kings. There are a few less than amazing Ridley Scott movies to choose from when it comes to the topic of late-era films by seasoned directors that aren't very good. Since 2010, there's been Robin Hood, The Counselor, and House of Gucci, but none are as difficult to defend as Exodus, Gods and Kings, which is arguably the weakest movie Scott has ever made during his long directorial career. This film is an epic that's never particularly exciting, and similarly fails to deliver much by way of spectacle through its retelling of the Book of Exodus. What was cinematic in the Ten Commandments, both the 1920s and 1950s versions, as well as the Prince of Egypt, can't really be found in Exodus, Gods and Kings, and it's a regrettably dull watch that fails to justify its existence. And number 1, the late-career horror movie that was considered to be the worst by Dario Argento, Dracula 3D. Thankfully, Dracula 3D was not the final feature film directed by Dario Argento, as his most recent to date came out a decade later, 2022's Dark Glasses. That one is a fairly decent, if somewhat unremarkable, effort from the legendary Italian filmmaker who's most well known for his horror movies, but it looks rather spectacular compared to the ugly, confused, and plotting mess that is Dracula 3D. Committing the cinematic sin of wasting Rutger Hauer, he even plays Van Helsing here. For crying out loud, Dracula 3D fails to make even things like violence or sleaze feel anywhere close to entertaining. It's totally boring and doesn't feel at all like it came from the same guy who made Suspiria, Deep Red, and Tenebra, making it debatably the worst late-era release from a, usually, great director.